Radio.
With my clients, I get them to weigh themselves every single day because I want to show you how ridiculous this scale weight is.
Hey y'all, I'm Ryan Devlin and welcome back to The Struggle. I'm so glad you're here. I hope you are having an awesome day. I'm really excited that you've tuned into this one here with Coach Tom Herbert, or better known as The Useful Coach on Instagram and on various outlets there. Tom's a pretty well-known face and name in the climbing nutrition world. He's got a background as a physical trainer, he's a climber, he's a dancer, and then specializes in nutrition, and especially nutrition for climbers. He works with Aiden Roberts. He works with a lot of other climbers. You've probably heard his podcast, and he's been a guest on many podcasts. So it's a really informed discussion that we have here. He brings, I think, a level of expertise and passion to this subject matter that I took a lot away from personally. Like, I am implementing a lot of the things he talked about in this conversation, and I'm feeling not only more energetic for my workouts, but I'm recovering faster as a result of doing this kind of bookending of carbs and fat and protein like we talk about in this. And we also talked about how does one cut weight really quickly for a project. And this actually is what spurred on this conversation in the first place. I reached out to him on Instagram. He was making a post about carbs. He's a big fan of carbs, as am I. But I asked him, like, hey, would it make sense to cut carbs for a short window if I kind of went crazy over a holiday weekend and I'm carrying around some extra weight and then I want to get back and feel peak on my project? And so we unpack that and so many other things in this. There's a lot of incredibly useful content in here, whether you're male or female, younger or older, whether you're on a specialized diet or you're experimenting with diets. We really cover so much in this conversation. I'm grateful for Tom's time, and I am grateful that you are here. Just a quick little shout out to all you patrons and subscribers that are listening out there. Thank you so much for supporting me with your dollars every month. It really, really means the world to me. I'm trying to make this podcast my full-time gig, which is kind of a crazy thing, but it's happening, and this community is growing really fast. I hope you guys are enjoying all that bonus content. And if you're listening to this right now and you aren't a patron or subscriber, I'd love for you to check it out. There's a free trial. I'll tell you more about that at the end. But first, grab the nearest pastry you can find. I'm choosing a donut, of course, but you do you. And let's take a big bite out of the nutrition game here with Useful Coach Tom Herbert.
I'm fighting a bit of a cold. I sound like Leonard Cohen today. Look how it is like I don't typically have this rich baritone, Tom, but I'm like, maybe I need to have colds more often.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
Yeah.
I got to bed at like 2 a.m. this morning studying, so I'm trying to not look too fatigued.
No, you're good. I mean, it's a podcast. Although I will release the video on Patreon, but those people love climbing so much, they don't care what we look like.
It's true.
I'm really excited to dive into this pro clinic with you on what I'm calling performance nutrition, but you may define it in a different way. This is an area I've explored a bit with some guests in the past, from Dave McLeod to Amity Warm to some other nutritionists, and then of course athletes. I have a chapter on nutrition in every interview that I do. But I think first, if we could, I'd like to set the stage for you as a professional, but also as a climber, as a dancer, as somebody who's passionate about a lot of things in sports and outside. Can you tell me a little bit about how you became the Useful Coach?
Kind of very long story short. So I was in the tech industry as a GNU Linux system administrator. That was my background. I was good at computers. But I always found myself working with people. I much preferred working with people or working between departments and things. And basically everything in my life always taken a sort of educational, diplomatic, bringing people together role, coaching role, this sort of thing. Anyway, I dated a climber for a little while, and she was a person who got me into climbing. And at the time, she had decided she was a big PR person with Dell Computers, and then basically decided to do massage therapy. And I thought, hey, can you do this? Can you just change career? I just thought this was not something that you could do, certainly if you've been paid well. So I decided on the whim to basically do a personal training qualification in personal training, because I thought this would be an interesting thing. I was involved with fitness and stuff. So I did that. And then I had which is the typical nutrition module for it. And I thought, this is pretty fascinating stuff. And then at the time, which would have been, I don't know, like 2015 or something, I realized that no one was really talking about nutrition and climbing in any rigorous sense. I mean, the only person I knew in kind of well-known circles was Neely Quinn, right? With the Beta podcast, right?
Sure.
And around that time, everyone was kind of getting involved with paleo and things like this and keto and off the shoots and stuff like that. And so what happened is ended up being just lots of conversations with climbers in the gym about nutrition. And I apparently seem to have known more than anyone else at the time. Or at least I had basically listened to people who were really arguing for the sort of scientific or evidence-based approach to nutrition rather than the kind of bro science, which back then really was the sort of prevailing way of doing anything. So it kind of evolved to that. And what happened is that I thought, it would be great is I could try and talk about this and kind of do a podcast talking about what is the sort of nitty-gritty bits of sports nutrition, which could be applied to climbers. And that's where I contacted Brian Rigby out in Boulder, Colorado. And he had run a website called Climbing Nutrition at the time. And I thought, well, this would be the best guy to talk to because he obviously knows more than I do. So anyway, we ended up having a single conversation. It lasted for 2 hours. And then Climb Side podcasts began, right? And it became incredibly popular. And it felt a bit strange because I had Brian, who was a climber, a proper climber. And there was me who basically had done a bit of plastic in the gym. But we worked very well because we both had this sort of passion of just stating the fact. What is the literature saying about sports nutrition or protein or carbs? And how could we apply that to climbing? Because again, there was really very few science papers out with climbers directly. So from that, I basically got a waiting list for about 6 months of people wanting to work with me. And really to kind of squeeze a very long story, roughly 2018, end of 2018 or so, I basically packed my bags and said, I'm going to try this time. And during this whole period of time, I was working with people in a personal training thing on the weekend. I was doing nutrition clients on the side and then kind of folding it all in. And that's really where it all started. And then obviously we had COVID and we had the lockdowns and I had to kind of just pivot. And I ended up just going completely online, stopped all my personal training because the gyms were closed. And then really just carried on working with people and having more and more discussions. And I did what I call, which is kind of unique in the industry, is what I call long form coaching, which is really what this podcast is. If you work with me, you have unlimited calls. If you wanted to speak to me every single day for 3 months, you could. Not that anybody would, but you could, right? I don't charge for the consultations. And so what that did is it allowed me a lot more scope to really listen to people, listen to their stories. Why were they coming from this background? Why were they struggling with nutrition, struggling with body image, and then all of this sort of stuff? So that's really how I ended up doing that in the climbing community, is I actually just kind of fell into a niche, not because I was particularly passionate about climbing. It just happened to be what I was doing in the most part, and was also the community that I was involved with. And I realized this community apparently doesn't have that much information about nutrition. And as we know, some of the practices that have been done over the years have really not been particularly healthy, both physically and psychologically. So that's where it's kind of been. And then the useful part of Useful Coach really is a very generic thing, is that this has been my, I don't know what you call it, like my mantra or North Star in my life is always basically kindness, integrity, and being useful. And the kind of the usefulness part is really just fulfills it everything. If you're going to be useful, then you're going to end up being those other things. So yeah, that's kind of where it goes. And it's just expanded and keeps expanding. But I still feel like a completely unprofessional in this industry. It's funny. I don't know where I get the respect from, but apparently I'm saying the right stuff. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've worked with over 300 climbers now, thousands of hours of conversation. And I think that when somebody achieves a result or has an experience that's positive, they share it. And then that's the best way to grow a business and to gain some notoriety. I'm curious about the useful. I just want to peel back on that again for just a second, because I've got a couple young kids and they both have gone through, and now we're on the other side of their Thomas the Train phase. And there's this big, I don't know if it's a British thing or what, but it always struck me as kind of an odd term, because Sir Topham Hatt always says, Thomas, you're a very useful engine. And I always thought
I've never realized that. I've never noticed that. Okay.
I thought maybe you had pulled it. You had borrowed it from Ringo Starr in the original Thomas the Trains, because useful, I don't know if that's like a British, I don't hear that being used as much here in America, helpful or kind or giving or whatever, maybe those terms are used, but like useful, there's like a utilitarian aspect to it that always kind of just like struck me a little bit when I would hear it on Thomas the Train. So maybe it's a British or South African thing, or maybe that's just a wild coincidence.
Maybe it was sub inputted into me from a young age without me even knowing. Right. I have never heard that. So yeah, we call it Thomas the Tank Engine here. Is it called Thomas the Train out there?
We always call it Thomas the Train. Maybe it is Thomas the Tank Engine, but no, we don't use tank engine. That's not like
that's a very old. That's an English phrase, yeah. But no, it's. I mean, I have my father was a pastor, so I grew up in a very Christian home. I actually went out of my IT career for a little bit to study theology because I thought I was going to go and be a pastor. So maybe there's a lot of sort of, I don't know, Calvinist work ethic or, wanting to be useful in the world. Yeah. So maybe there's a little bit of element of that's involved. But I think what it was it's a phrase which I just think is, for me, it's very much about uplifting and about service to individuals or service in a situation. And that's why it's always resonated with me, is that, my personality is the person who, if we go to a party together, I'm going to look around the room and find the guy or the girl who's standing in the corner looking kind of a little bit sort of nervous. And I'm going to go and make friends with them. And we'll end up chatting about, I don't know, mathematics for 2 hours, right? So sure. That's how I approach business, how I approach my clients. And so it's been really lovely actually as a brand because it's so generic. I can do whatever I want in the future and I can keep my same branding, which I'm very glad for,
Well, let's be useful today here. I'll try to make this a useful podcast with the useful coach. And let's start where we always start with struggle, Tom. And we're going to be talking about performance nutrition here, specifically through the lens of climbing, but life as well, as you often write about, real people, right? Quote unquote. We're all real people here. Most of the people listening to this podcast do not make their living, do not pay the bills as rock climbers. We're doing it for enjoyment. We may be wanting to push our limits, our personal limits, and have varying levels of dedication around that. I'm personally in a phase where I'm trying to push pretty hard and I'm willing to sacrifice for it. Others, weekend warriors, just out there to have fun. But we're real people, but we're also climbers and we do want to perform and stay healthy, whatever that may mean. And we'll peel that back with you. But as this is the struggle, can you share where you've struggled or maybe are even struggling in the area of your expertise, performance nutrition?
What a great question. So as a professional, I don't know if I would say is a struggle, but I think there's a lot of, and this would be a good thing for sort of upcoming coaches, both in nutrition and other areas. And you stressed on this, and this is the fact that we work with real people. It's very easy to come into this sort of field where you have an expertise in the information that you have garnered through your education. Right? When you actually work with real people, you realize that most of it can't be applied in the way that you assume you could apply it. And if not, most of it gets just thrown out and you have to find some sort of middle ground or a fuzzy way of applying it with people. And what that means is when you first start, you'll have this great structure in your brain and all of these really cool things that you want to apply with people because you know that in the text, in the literature, this has this effect. And if you did, this would work. I mean, the people who know this the most are probably upcoming strength and conditioning coaches, right? Because they want to do periodized models and they want to do this and they want to apply this and they want this person to progress in this. But you realize that no, because what happens is that who are you working with? Are you working with a family man? Are you working with a single parent? Are you working with a 22-year-old who's studying? Are you working with somebody who's recently got divorced? Are you working with somebody who has a chronic illness, right? It doesn't work that way. And so what you've got to really realize is that you've got to take the information that is a body of literature about what is most likely going to be effective or what we've seen replicated, right? That's in the literature. And then figure out, how do I take this information and apply this? Or rather, serve it to somebody in a way that they can say, oh, well, actually, this resonates and I can do this. So the struggle is really the personal side of things, right? And then the other thing is really, and this is what I love about this thing, the coaching the most, is the communication aspect, right? You might be a really smart person. And I've known people like this who are incredibly good textbook smart. These are the people who should be writing science papers, right? Because that's the way they think. They're really not good communicators, right? They're not particularly personable, right? you get the other side where you get some people, and this is what you see in social media, they're very good rhetorics. They're very good talks. They can be very present. They can make anything sound authoritative, right? But they don't have a very good grasp of whatever, let's say literature or content or the scientific method or something, right? So the main thing is really when somebody comes to me for coaching is that I've got to immediately figure out who are they and how do they see the world and how do I apply the information in a way that's going to create an effect for them. And that's the fun bit. And again, I don't know if it's such a struggle. I mean, if there is any struggles in what I've done, is probably more the business side of things, right? Or things like that. But in terms of it's much more of a learning and the fun part of it, you know. And there's a crossover in dance. This is why I like dance so much, because it's communication. Within, I don't know, a couple of seconds of holding somebody's hands, because I do social dancing, I can tell how this person is going to respond or what their personality is, right? What their sense of space is, if they're comfortable with me, if they're more playful, if they listen to this part of the music, within like 4 or 5 seconds of holding them. And it's the same way with a person. So for instance, the video software that I use gives me a little window of the person so I can see them before they enter the room. And what that does is immediately I will look and see what their posture is, how they're sitting. You know, I'm giving away secrets now, but I will look at them for that sort of 5 seconds and try and gauge my body language and the way that I'm going to talk to them, right? With female clients, I will sometimes be a lot more relaxed, or I will normally make a joke at the very onset to try and create a little bit of rapport. For some older individuals, I'll probably sit up straight a little bit, or maybe button one of my buttons, right? So there's all these sort of things that you do because at the end of the day, so in therapy, because I'm now studying cognitive behavioral therapy, there's a concept called the Therapeutic Alliance. And this really is the strongest effect. It's almost like 50% of the therapeutic effect of going to therapy is the relationship you have with the therapist. So again, it's not necessarily a struggle professionally, but it's much more of a kind of a nuance. And that's the fun bit of it, is like, how do I take things that I know work well, both from the textbook and from experience working with multiple clients, and communicate it in a way that somebody can actually use it.
Right, because you're working with a person. You're not working with a spreadsheet. You're not working just with a stomach. You're working with a person. We have emotions. We have stresses and anxieties and lives and all sorts of things. And I think that's one of the things, Tom, that makes nutrition in general, but certainly in my experience hosting this podcast for a couple of years now, that nutrition chapter tends to be the most individualized, kind of the hardest one to draw common themes and threads from, from pro climber to pro climber to pro climber. You can oftentimes see in the training chapter or even in the mental game chapter, some themes of how a work to rest ratio that's working, or fears of failure, or fears of falling. And then nutrition, it's like, man, anything goes. It's like we've all had it's all wrapped up in our upbringing and our emotions and our ego and this kind of thing. And so perhaps a second pro clinic will be about that side, because I think that's fascinating and would likely require a couple hours in and of itself. So our challenge today is to try to look at some themes, because I don't want this to be a conversation where you're coaching me. We can use me if you want to, explore a couple little topics here about things I'm struggling with or my diet. But my hope is that looking back on 300 climbers now that you've worked with, you might actually have an expert lens that I haven't been able to tap into yet on this show, where maybe there are some themes, or at least some the big area of the bell curve that we could kind of tap into around nutrition in our lifestyle, for performance, for peaking, diets, performance hacks, secrets, tips, tricks, all the things, I want to try to explore here in the next 90 minutes or so. And maybe a great place for us to start is something that you've talked about in the past, where you've said the body is not a calorie ledger. And I'd love to have you explore that for a little bit, and then we can take it where it takes us.
Yeah, sure. So I think this is the biggest thing. This is the thing that I think people get wrong. And this can go pretty deep. But quickly to zoom out. So like you said, one of the problems with nutrition is that it seems to be such a wide, unspecific thing. So let's say outside of something that is very specific, like a nutrient deficiency, right? Say B12. Someone hasn't ever taken B12 supplements and they've been vegan for whatever, let's say 10 years. That is a very specific thing that you can actually address very specifically with B12, for instance, right?
Right.
But other than that, the reason that nutrition is such a difficult subject in terms of the misinformation mixed in with information that you see everywhere is because it seems to be such a broad effect. There's very few things in nutrition that if you do this, you see this outcome here immediately. And this is why you'll get some people who will say, oh, a carnivore diet has been the most healthful thing. It has improved all of my markers of health. And on the exact opposite, it'll be like a raw fruit vegan diet has done the exact same thing for this person. And how can these two things be true? And then you have another person who'll be like, oh yeah, I've basically climbed some of the best climbs in the world, basically smoking a joint and drinking whiskey, right? And I eat pizza all the time, right? And if you listen to some of the pro climbers, they don't have a particularly good diet. I mean, it's getting better, I think at some level because of things that I've said. This is the thing is that people are like, well, how does this even matter then, right? And I think this is the problem with it or not the problem, but this is the difficult thing with it. It seems to have a very broad effect. So if we zoom in now, when I say the body isn't a calorie ledger, what I mean by that is that we have a kind of a misunderstanding of, let's say, what we do or what we perceive that we are doing and its effect on the body. The body absolutely is obeying the laws of physics. The problem is that we don't really have a way of seeing all of the elements that are involved. So the way that I describe the body to my clients is much more like a weather pattern. If I do something over here that creates a pressure change, 1 or 2 days later, that has an effect somewhere else. And it's all of these effects that are appearing. If you've got to understand that the body really is a very complex bag of chemicals, right? And if you change an equilibrium or a gradient of a chemical here, it's going to affect gradients later on and all these other downstream effects. And then you put in something that has a level of intelligence, meaning the brain is controlling some of these things, causing receptors here to come up and things to downgrade and DNA transcription, all this. You have this very complex system, right? And then you have the other side of it, which is the whatever level of cognition that we have, meaning that we're making changes based on our behavior. For instance, we're choosing when or when not to eat, whether or not we're hungry, right? Or we're doing things, we're pushing through discomfort in climbing or sport against our physiology and all these sort of things. So what we got to understand, and this is if we talk about themes that I have noticed over working with people, is this model where you got to understand that, well, the way that I talk mostly about it now is much more of a behavioral thing. How does eating now affect your behavior later? What are you eating now? The types of food and the way are you eating? How does that affect your behavior later? And behavior, I mean things like, for instance, if you don't eat enough today, and enough will come into, if you don't eat enough today, how does that change your behavior in 2 days' time? It might affect how hard you train in 2 days' time. And if you don't train very hard, or for instance, your performance sucks on the Tuesday because you didn't eat enough on the Sunday, now you're going to feel bad about yourself and you're going to have a negative spiral. And you might do something that's even more detrimental to the rest of your training. You might, I don't know, go out and eat certain foods that you don't like normally eating because it upsets your stomach, or maybe you go drinking, or maybe you'll skip workouts, or you just go into spiral. And all of that was because, for instance, I've seen this, you decided to not eat that much when you went on a really long hike with your friends on the weekend because you're not really hungry when you hike and it's low intensity. And so when I speak to people, I'm like, there's a difference between nutrition and what I call sports nutrition. Nutrition is eating healthy, right? The general understanding of what most of us understand is that. Sports nutrition, I sum up as eating when you're not necessarily hungry. You're eating with a purpose. And that purpose is normally something that's going to come 2 or 3 days later. And so that's the difference. Sports nutrition is disciplined eating, and nutrition can be much more doing the best thing with the choices that you have. And that can be much more intuitive. So what I mean by the calorie ledger is really just that we can't view that the food I'm eating right now is going to be used and matched in terms of energy and all these sort of things in the next, 24 hours. And I'll let you jump in here, but the easiest way I explain it to people is that your body has no idea that, and this is what I mean by ledger, you don't get to midnight and your body says, no, you had a deficit today. So you are now dieted today. Tomorrow, now you're back to square one and you're supposed to eat 2,600 calories. You get to midnight and the body's like, no, you ate 2,500 calories and you only ate 125 grams of protein rather than 150. You know what I mean? Obviously, the body does not work like it has no idea.
Right.
So if you understand the body as a weather pattern, you realize that what I do today at 3:00 is going to have this wave effect of pressure, if we use this metaphor of weather, that's going to interrupt a pressure gradient somewhere else. Now, most of the time we're doing things with a schedule, and Vince's training, when we do things with a schedule, we kind of are able to replicate. Most Mondays, I know I can certainly deadlift a certain amount because it's in that schedule of my week. But you've got to realize if you suddenly have a stress, and this is my model and we can go into this, if you have a stress that suddenly happens on a Tuesday because we live in the real world in real time and we're real people, that is going to affect all these other things. So you can't view, well, I ate 2,500 calories today. That's what I'm supposed to eat. What, by midnight? By 3 p.m.? What about the window of time between the training? Or do you need food so for early in the morning compared to in the evening? So this is why it's incredibly complex. And there's no way that we can measure it or program it. You just got to kind of ride the waves and understand and explore the patterns.
It's a good, I think, real world, nuanced look, because only under the strictest circumstances could we probably actually program out a week or 2 weeks or a month based on exactly what our training and lifestyle are going to hold. And for most of us, that's not realistic at all. So it's a more holistic look that you have at it. But I'm going to press you throughout this conversation.
Please.
As I did with Dave McLeod, and he just kept dodging me. So we'll see how good you are at dodging, coming to any sort of concrete conclusions. But let's make an effort to try to offer up some patterns or some conclusions. And there's two, if I'm thinking in a very general sense here, there's kind of two things that come to my mind when I think about sports nutrition or performance nutrition. And one is having the fuel, for lack of a better word, to do the things that we want to do, which is like train, perform, climb hard, send the project, recover, not get injured, wake up feeling good the next day so I can do it again. And then there's weight, which is a bit of a third rail for all the reasons everybody already understands in the history of our sport and other weight, strength to weight ratio sports and this kind of thing, but also is real. And I hope I don't come off as like politically incorrect here, but if you're carrying around, for those of us who are listening, right? So now we're not talking about the pros who might already be at single digit, body fat percentages and things like that. For most people listening that do have real lives, me with 2 kids and I enjoy beer and cake and these kinds of things, there probably is an aspect of weight that could be managed in a way that likely would help me, or maybe not. I'd love for you to chime in on this, but first of all, am I understanding kind of those 2 general pillars well? And then maybe we can just start to peel back on both of those and use your lens to see if there are some general tips and understandings or areas that we could take away when it comes to fueling and when it comes to weight management or body composition or however you like to look at that.
No, sure. And I don't stray away from weight. I want to talk about weight as more than anybody in the industry, right? I wrote 12,000 words on weight, right? Because I think it's put under taboo because people don't want to talk about it. So I'm happy to.
Yeah.
But let's start with the fueling thing. So my model, from what I'm aware, doesn't exist in any textbook, right? So I'm hoping that I will be justified in my later years when the textbooks start writing about this. And they might already be doing a little bit, and I'll explain this. When you speak to most people who are much more educated than I am, they will always say, and I can imagine Dave said this, that at the end of the day, things like carbohydrate before training don't seem to make that much difference. Or if you eat a relatively low carbohydrate diet, we have good studies to show that your body just restores its glycogen levels to baseline, that you don't have to eat carbohydrate to maintain glycogen in your muscles. You can't super compensate. You can't get higher levels necessarily, but that seems fine.
Or even that maybe we don't even use all that much glycogen for many types of climbing unless we're doing really big wall, epic days, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. And that basically, yes, from a textbook definition of carbohydrates, if we're going to zoom into there, because this is kind of the fuel part, before performance is that up to about an hour, you don't really need to do anything. It shows no performance benefit. Maybe for 2 hours, you put about 30 to 60 grams of carbs, and anything over 3 hours, you kind of dose. You hit the sort of endurance level, and you're dosing maybe 30 to 60 grams every hour, depending on how long it is. And that's all true. That seems to be what we can see in the literature, right? And there comes Tom Herbert saying, why don't you push it above 70 grams up to maybe 100, 120 grams of carbohydrate before your hour session, right? And then stick another 100 grams after your hour session, right? And why don't you put 30 grams protein before and afterwards as well? And people are like, what the hell, man? Why would you do that? There's no research to say that's efficacious at all. You don't need a fuel. What are you fueling? I put a metabolic mask on somebody doing 40 minutes of bouldering indoors, and it was about 7 calories a minute, or about 200 and something, maybe 300 calories for that bouldering session. And I'm saying, hey, over this window of 2 hours, I want you to have like 200 grams of carbohydrate and maybe like 50 to 60 grams of protein, right?
Yeah,
it's like nuts. Why would you do that? So this is the way that I view things. The body's not a ledger of that, right? And how the hell do we know what is our glycogen levels at the point when we're going to start our climbing session? We could hazard that unless you did a really full body workout the day before and had no carbohydrate for dinner, then maybe you're at the sort of low end baseline for glycogen. But even then, you don't even necessarily need that to do the work for the wall. So what am I doing? My model is based on this lag that I see, meaning what you eat today doesn't necessarily affect you right now, but affects things maybe 1 or 2 days later, right? There's a lag. The other thing is about behavior. How do you repeat good behavior, right? There's that part of it. The other part of it is what I call basically the fundamental thing of how I apply nutrition is how do you mitigate stress, or rather, and I'm putting these in air quotes, how do you convert that stress into something beneficial? So we know this in terms of training. You stress your body. We sometimes call it eustress. And that stress, if in the right applied correctly, will become training adaptations, right? If you do it too much and you don't have the capacity to handle that stress, you create strain in the system, which you have to recover from. So there's this constant balance between creating stress in the system, right? It deforms under the stress, and then through recovery, sleep, nutrition, mindfulness, it basically recovers and you get stronger so you can now handle more load. That's why when you pick up heavier weights in the gym, the heavier weights are not making you better. They're the result of being better. That's why you can pick up heavier weights, right? So my model is, okay, how do we change the state of the body when it's put under the most amount of stress? How do we change the physiological state of the body when it's under the most stress so that it can handle a huge amount of stress and then as quickly as possible, turn that, in air quotes, convert that stress.
All right, that seems like a good place for us to fade out here. I'm sorry to do the fade out. You know, I make these episodes for patrons and subscribers because it helps me to keep the lights on over here in the podcast/utility closet. So what are we talking about here in the rest of this Pro Clinic? It is very nutrient dense, as you would expect a conversation about nutrition to be. And we cover some stuff that's really changed the game for me in terms of how I'm feeling for my climbing and how I'm feeling recovered, really recovered, after a try-hard session out at the crag or at the gym. So what are some practical, and by the way, delicious ways that you can fuel for these workout sections? And yes, it includes donuts. Thank you very much, Tom. I appreciate that. How to handle fueling and nutrition just in general on our on days versus our off days. That was something I was a little bit confused about. Like if I'm going to have a day where I'm basically just sitting at the computer recording a podcast like I'm doing right now versus if I'm going to be out like charging hard, how should my nutrition change in like when real life hits, essentially? How to look at our training weight versus our project weight and how we can manipulate our weight very quickly using some ideas and some, I don't want to call them tricks because that sounds like a little bit clickbaity, but essentially some concepts that Tom brings up to very quickly manipulate weight up to a handful of pounds, 4 or 5 pounds in just a couple of days if you really do want to zero in on a project And then also, if we want to lose weight like long-term, not just cut like temporarily for a project like I'm talking about there, but if we want to really diet and drop weight, Tom talks about the best time, the best opportunities to explore that. Tom unpacks carbs and looks at no-carb diets and low-carb diets and really has a lot to say about that as it pertains to us as climbers and the science behind low-carb and no-carb diets. All that and just so much more is available for about the price of a beer over on Patreon or Apple subscriptions, or actually zero cost right now with a free trial. So if you want to hear the rest of this Pro Clinic, plus get instant access to more than 60 hours of other banger content, and I'm talking about Pro Clinics and bonus episodes from the likes of Adam Andra, Chris Sharma, Nina Williams, Dave McLeod, Hazel Finley, Tom Randall, Alex Honnold, and so many more. It's all over there. I think it's worth a few bucks a month, but if you don't like it, you can cancel anytime. No worries, no questions asked. If you're an iPhone person, you can subscribe right there in your Apple Podcast player, or just swing on over to patreon.com/The Struggle Climbing Show to support me there and get instant access to all those goods. Now be sure to check your show notes for links from this conversation and how to work with today's pro, and you can see clips from this conversation over on IG at The Struggle Climbing Show. The Struggle is carbon neutral in partnership with the Honnold Foundation and is a proud member of the Plugtone Audio Collective, a diverse group of the best, most impactful podcasts in the outdoor industry. This show was produced and hosted by me, Ryan Devlin, and edited by Glen Walker. All right, what are you waiting for? Pop over to Patreon and listen to the rest of this Banger Pro Clinic. I hope your training and your climbing are going great. And you know what? If you're struggling like me, well, let's just remember that the struggle makes us stronger. I'll see y'all.